Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today we're going to be kicking off the 2019 year-end list with my top 10 worst albums of 2019. So as per usual with my year-end list and really just all the lists I do on this channel, I'm just going to go over some basic guidelines for this list. Pretty much to be on this list, it had to be an album released in 2019. That should be kind of obvious, but I will say it anyways. Also, this list is just based on my own personal opinion and based on the albums I happen to hear in 2019. If an album you like is on this list, it doesn't mean I hate you or anything, or that you have like bad taste or anything. It's just, it's not my taste, and it's on this list just because I didn't happen to care for it personally. And yeah, I don't hear every project released in 2019, so this isn't like a definitive list of, out of every album released in 2019, what the lowest 10 would be. This is just based on the pool of albums I happen to hear, which, even though I do hear a good amount of albums in a year, there's still plenty of them I don't get around to hearing. So, yeah, with those things said, let's just get into the list, because I have a feeling that this is going to take a bit of time. So, yeah, let's start with number 10 on my list, which is Baroness with Golden Grey. This is a record that not only was a record that I didn't like, but it's also a project that was a pretty big disappointment for me because I was really looking forward to this album, and this was a project that was so close to being not just good, but great in my opinion. The songwriting on this thing is pretty great, some of the most diverse and interesting that the band has ever brought to an album before. The performances on this thing are also pretty solid too. There's a nice variety of songs on this thing as well. Sure, I do think the project is a little bloated, and there are some interlude-type tracks that really don't serve much of a purpose, but with those complaints aside, this is an album that easily could have ended up on my best of the year list. But there is one big problem that gets in the way of me enjoying this record, and that is the production here on this thing. The production here on this album is some of the worst that I've heard on any album in recent memory, really. It's just that terrible. And I do understand that a lot of rock and metal music particularly likes to go for a very rough sounding style of production to help with getting across a very dark or nasty sound. But that doesn't really work for this album because the sound that Baroness shoots for on this thing is one that I think is pretty lush sounding. That's very full. There's a lot going on here. And this isn't even a super heavy record. A lot of the songs on here are a bit softer, and a lot of the tracks here, I think, lean a lot more towards something like stoner or psychedelic rock than they do maybe anything in the metal genre. I do know that Baroness have, put out metal material in the past, but not really so much on this project. And the really rough production on this thing just does not suit the album whatsoever. And instead, a lot of the tracks on here that would otherwise sound very lush and beautiful and textured just end up sounding really crappy, honestly, because I can't even hear half the details put into this song very clearly. And whenever there are moments on this thing where I feel like the band is very close to getting across something very interesting, maybe some of the instrumentals in a particular track are really interesting and textured, or a hook is particularly catchy, it's oftentimes ruined by the production. There's so much potential here in this record, and it kind of disappoints me to have to put it on this list because there was obviously a lot of hard work and effort put into this thing, because outside of the production, for the most part, this is a really enjoyable record, but that production, man, it just really gets in the way of my enjoyment of this project. Most of the time I would try to listen to this thing before reviewing it initially, and even coming back to it again before this list, it would just give me a headache. And even though there are a lot of good things packed into this record, if it gives me a headache almost every time I listen to it because of the production, that just can't be a good thing in my eyes. And unfortunately, I have to put this album here on this list, even if it is pretty low on the list. Like I said in my review of this thing, I hope this album gets some sort of remaster or remix in the future that fixes this production issue, because I feel like if that's done, this could be a really enjoyable record. I would be happy to, listen to this in its fullest, most enjoyable format, but unfortunately in its current state, that just won't be happening. Moving on, the next record I want to talk about is Beck's Hyperspace, another album I was looking forward to but was let down by, mostly because the style of music that Beck tries to go for on this thing just doesn't end up being super interesting, at least to me. The sound of this thing is very spacey, atmospheric, synth-driven as well, but it doesn't lead to a lot of interesting songs. Really, the track Uneventful Days is the only song on here that I liked to any extent, and even then it's just a decent track in my opinion, mostly because it actually manages to have a kind of memorable hook to it and a kind of interesting instrumental too. Again, not one of the best Beck has ever made or anything, but it is definitely the high point on this thing. But pretty much everything else on this record is really bland, really forgettable, really uninteresting. There's no memorable hooks across this project outside of that track 2. The instrumentals are just pretty bland as well. It really just feels like this album is trying to be one big vibe that just never ends up being interesting. The track Saw Lightning is another moment on this project where that kind of breaks away from the typical mold of this album, but in the case of this song, that's not really in a good way, as this ends up being one of the most annoying songs Beck has written to date, which is a really obnoxious feel to it that also kind of stands out in a really strange way compared to a lot of the other songs on this thing, just because sonically it sounds so different and so upbeat. I don't know, overall this was just a really dull project in my opinion. Definitely not one that I want to return to in the future, even if there were maybe one or two moments on it I thought were okay. Moving on, the next record I want to talk about is Jaden's Iris, a sequel album to his debut record Sire, released back in 2017. An album that I didn't really care for all too much, but I did see a lot of potential in it, and I was hoping that Jaden would fulfill this potential on his second record. And unfortunately, that's not really the case here on this thing, as this album feels more like a stagnant follow-up to Sire than anything else. I do get that they're supposed to be similar albums in the sense that they're thematically tied together and they have similar structures, but more often than not, this album just feels like a lesser version of that album. Sure, there are still occasionally some moments on this thing that are decent, but oftentimes these come as a result of the featured artist, either that or they still end up feeling like lesser versions of moments off Sire. Like, for example, the opener to this thing, the multi-part track Pink, is a pretty decent collection of tracks, but it still isn't quite as good as the multi-part opener to Sire, and in a lot of ways it just ends up feeling like a lesser version of that, even if it is still pretty okay overall. But even outside of these moments, the instrumentals are probably the strongest thing about this record, being pretty decent overall, but Jaden himself ends up being the weakest link in everything here on this project, as his rapping and singing isn't really super passionate or involved, I feel. It hasn't really grown a lot since Sire either. The lyrics here on this thing aren't super interesting too. Again, they just kind of feel like a recycled batch of ideas that were present on Sire, or maybe the mixtape he dropped last year too. This just ends up feeling like a slightly lesser version of the project he dropped a couple years back, and like I said, I already didn't really care for that record all too much, but unlike with that album where I saw a lot of potential in it, a couple years later, and, after getting the same thing pretty much, I just see a lot less potential overall for Jaden's career in the future. I do hope maybe he proves me wrong with that and that he actually drops something worthwhile going forward, but overall, this is really just more of the same of Sire, which, like I just said, I really didn't care for. Moving on, the next record on my list is Chance the Rapper's The Big Day. Now, even though this is on my list and it's a record I don't like, I am kind of surprised that this record is getting as much hate as it is. Just because I don't think it's as terrible a record as some people make it out to be. I mean, yes, I don't like it. Obviously, it is on this list after all. But, I mean, some people saying it's like one of the worst of the decade. Really? At the very least, I do think that Chance has a solid idea with the concept of this record being focused on his marriage and wedding and all of that. I think that's an interesting idea and that he could have done good things with it here on this thing. It's just that the execution leaves a lot to be desired, mostly because a lot of Chance's flows on here just aren't super interesting. A lot of the hooks here aren't super interesting either. The instrumentals really aren't terrible, but they oftentimes are really similar to one another, and again, they're just not the most interesting too. And when it comes to the lyrics here on this thing, like I said, the overall concept of this project is kind of interesting, but when you break it down, track by track, I don't really feel like Chance goes into enough detail on a lot of these songs to really warrant this album's really lengthy runtime. I think there's a lot you could talk about with this subject, but Chance just really, stays on the surface with a lot of it, which is kind of surprising considering that he made a whole nearly, hour and 20-minute long record about it. I would expect him to go into a ton of detail with it. And speaking of this album's runtime length, it is just way too long. It just drags on and on and on. And if he was doing really interesting things with the subject matter and maybe had some more interesting and diverse sounds and flows on this thing, maybe that runtime could work. I could see it working in that context. But in the state it's currently in, it just makes for a very monotonous, boring listen, as it seems like track after track after track of very similar songs where Chance just kind of stays on the surface of this really vague subject, and a lot of his flows feel similar, the beats feel similar, the features kind of break things up occasionally, but even then they're not super interesting. I feel like this album either needed to be cut down to a much shorter runtime, or just fleshed out a lot more with its lyrical depth and sounds and ideas in order to really work. I do see an idea in here that could work. It's just buried under a lot of repetitive content. So yeah, overall, The Big Day really didn't do much for me. Again, I think this album gets way more hate than it should, but, still, I don't care for it. Moving on, the next record I want to talk about is Blink-182's 9, a record that I was looking forward to quite a bit, given that their deluxe edition of California fixed some of the problems I had with the standard edition of that record, and I was hoping on their upcoming record that they were going to be able to fix even more problems I had with California, and maybe do so to the point where the album was actually really good, but that didn't quite end up being the case here on 9, only somewhat, I guess, because they do fix a lot of the problems I had with California. The thing is, they just introduced a lot of other problems into this thing too, to the point where it ends up being just a not very enjoyable experience overall. I like that the sound of this thing is a bit rougher overall, but it is to the point where a lot of the instrumentals here on this thing just kind of blend together into this really big, homogeneous blob of pop punk that just isn't super interesting or memorable. I don't think any of the riffs here are super exciting. The drum work is probably the best part of this project, but I still wouldn't say that it's some of the best that Blink has ever had. The bass work isn't super memorable either, and again, it all just kind of blends together into this big blob of pop punk instrumental that just isn't super exciting or interesting, even if I do like the fact that it does sound a bit more rough around the edges. The vocals, on the other hand, are still just as overproduced as ever, and I don't really care for this part of the project. I just feel like both vocalists here have their vocals just so manipulated to the point where they really lose a lot of that natural energy that you would probably get from them otherwise, which I was kind of hoping to see, given that both of them are pretty good vocalists in their own right, and they could have easily sounded nicer over these more rough-sounding instrumentals had their vocals not really been tampered with as much, but instead you just get some really overproduced-sounding vocals that also don't really pair up nicely with these instrumentals because, like I said, the instrumentals sound a bit rougher, the vocals not really at all. It just makes for a really odd mixture. Lyrically, the band isn't really doing too much interesting on this record either. At their best, the lyrics on this thing are just kind of boring and forgettable. At their worst, it just feels like the band is trying way too hard to pander to a lot of Gen Z people, a lot of millennials too. It just feels very insincere and just not very interesting too. The best that you really get on this record is that some of the hooks on these songs are kind of catchy, but given that this is pop punk, it's kind of to be expected, and you have to do a lot more than that to really hold my attention. So yeah, overall, 9 is just a record that really ended up disappointed me. It could have been a lot better than it actually was. I just feel like it ends up being a mess of sorts, and just a pretty forgettable one at that too. Moving along though, the next record on my list is the newest record from Future. Future Hendrix presents The Wizard. I really don't have too much to say about this project because really I could sum up this record by just really saying that it's a Future record for better or for worse. I don't think it's one of his better releases, and for the most part, it just kind of feels like Future on autopilot, really. Occasionally, you will get a nice melody or hook on this thing, but that's really all I could say about it. The rest of this thing just feels really generic and bland. The instrumentals aren't super interesting. I wouldn't say too many of them are super terrible or anything, but kind of like the Beck album I was talking about all too long ago, they just end up blending together into this very forgettable mixture of sounds. And vocals, Future's vocal performances on this thing are also pretty bland too. Furthermore, I really feel like this album runs way too long as well. It just feels like a really bloated, uninteresting mass of generic trap music that could have ended up a lot better than it actually does. I mean, again, I don't have too much to say about this record, really. If you're familiar with Future and the kind of music that he makes, you kind of know what this sounds like, but this isn't some of the best music that he's put out before. While I wouldn't say I'm a big Future fan or anything, he definitely has it in him to make better music than this, and this is just really future on autopilot, really, like I said before. That's the best way to sum it up. Next on the list, though, I have Weezer with their self-titled Teal record. This was the first of 2 records that Weezer dropped this year, and is a covers album, actually. And I know a lot of people have some excuses for this record. You know, it's just supposed to be a fun covers record, and that's nothing that's supposed to be taken all too seriously. And that, yeah, I kind of get that. This wasn't a record that was obviously meant to be taken all too seriously. And it was obviously just put out to draw some more attention to the band prior to dropping their Black self-titled record, which was obviously the more, the record that had more effort put into it, the record that was obviously a bit bigger for the band when it came to album releases. But even still, that doesn't excuse the fact that Teal through and through is just a really crappy cover album. I mean, there's absolutely nothing in this album that's exciting or interesting to any extent at all. None of the songs on this thing end up being better than their original counterparts, or even close to being better than their original counterparts. They just sound so much more lifeless and uninteresting. Weezer really just does absolutely nothing with these tracks to make them a bit more interesting or unique or their own. It's just like the band is on autopilot here playing these songs because they know it'll be kind of, you know, interesting, I guess, for some people who are big fans of the band, or people who like the Africa meme maybe too, because that song ends up on this thing as well. But aside from that, this is just a super boring, uninteresting listen. The only times on this record where the band really tries for a sound that's kind of different is on tracks like Paranoid or No Scrubs, where the songs that they're covering are just so different from the band's core sound that they end up sounding kind of different, but not really in a way that sounds good. It just seems kind of awkward, or kind of like the band is trying too hard to sound like the original artist, to the point where it really loses the core sound that makes Weezer Weezer. It's just, it doesn't make for good music overall. This is just a really bland listen from start to finish. And I know some people excuse it because it's supposed to be fun and all, but this isn't really a fun project. There's nothing about this that's really fun or exciting. Like I said, the instrumentals here are so much more bland and lifeless compared to the original instrumentals that all of these songs are over. Rivers' vocal performances on these tracks are so much weaker compared to the original songs, and he picks like the worst songs on this thing to try to cover. Tracks like Africa and Take On Me and a Michael Jackson track too. Like, what made him think he was going to be able to pull off tracks like these with vocals like the original tracks have? I think he's a good vocalist overall, but he's nowhere close to being good enough to pull off tracks like these. And even with that said, these are still some of his weakest vocal performances, I feel, in recent memory. So with that all said, Teal just ends up being a really forgettable, bland, uninteresting cover record. I mean, I guess if you really like Weezer and you really like everything that they do Weezer even have fans like that, honestly? But if you are one of those people, maybe I could see you getting enjoyment out of this just because it's Weezer and Weezer alone, but honestly, you're better off listening to just a playlist of all these songs in their original formats instead, even though it won't flow together quite as nicely because the artists that they're covering are pretty eclectic. It would still make for a much more enjoyable listen than Weezer's version of it, because Weezer's is so much more lifeless and uninteresting, and it was obviously just put together to draw more attention to the band prior to dropping the Black record, and like I said before, go off the hype that the band was already getting with their cover of Africa that they released the year prior that also ends up on this thing. I just really wish that the band had just skipped over this record entirely and maybe put a bit more effort into working on Black, because while I do think that record is pretty okay, I feel like it could have been a lot better too, and had the band used the time that they had spent working on this project, working on that one, I think Black could have been a pretty decent follow-up to White or Pacific Daydream, whichever record came first. Yeah, Teal is just really bland. Moving on, though, the next record on the list is Logic's Confessions of a Dangerous Mind. 2019 was not a year that was kind to Logic overall, and believe me, we will be coming back to him later on this list, but for this record here and now, I feel like this album is kind of the culmination of the past few years of Logic's career to some extent. Because I feel like in recent years, a lot of the music he's been putting out has been kind of underwhelming, kind of uninteresting, but not outright terrible either. None of those albums or mixtapes have made my worst of the year list in the past, and I would still kind of stand by that now. But this record here, it was a massive nosedive in quality for him that I kind of feel like is the result to some extent of dropping material so frequently, but also just a result of a lot of other terrible things too. The beats on this thing are probably the strongest part of it overall, but even then, they're not super interesting. Logic's flows on this thing really aren't super great. Technically, he's pretty impressive, but a lot of times he spits so fast and so technically on this thing that it just ends up sounding kind of uninteresting, and you really don't have the time to digest what's going on in the lyrics here. Not that you really want to, honestly, because the lyrics on this thing are easily the worst part of this album as a whole, just because of how gross they end up being. Logic on this record is really trying to tackle the topic of social media and being an artist surrounded by it and how this affects him, and the whole tortured soul kind of thing. But it just ends up sounding really gross with some of the lines that he brings out here on this thing, talking about things like mental health and things of that sort. There's lyrics on this thing, like on the title track, for example, where he kind of blames artists ODing on drugs as being the result of seeing hate and criticism on social media, which really isn't all that true. There's no connection between those, really. Like, I'm sure that, seeing hate and all that on social media would make an artist unhappy. Maybe they would turn to drugs as a result of that, but there's been no direct, link between the two things, and the fact that Logic kind of ties them together on this track is kind of gross overall. There's also lyrics on this thing where he claims to want bipolar disorder like Kanye in order to make music like him, which really is not how bipolar disorder works. It doesn't make you like a musical genius or anything. It's just something that's terrible and that you don't want to have at all. So why Logic claims to want it here is really beyond me. He also claims to want to be crazy like Kid Cudi because he's also another musical genius that he looks up to, and again, kind of gross. There's also a line on here where he brags about all the money he made off of the Suicide Hotline track, off of Everybody, which, again, really gross because that's a serious subject matter. Suicide is not something to be joked about, and the fact that he's kind of bragging about his profits off a song about that, which is already a song that a lot of people kind of viewed as not being a super great representation of the subject matter, given some of the lines in that track, which I really won't get into here. But yeah, it just ends up coming across really gross on this record. I won't go over any more specific examples here because I can honestly be here all day listing off examples, but instead I'll just say that some of the other lyrics on this project tackle social media, how it's bad in a way that's really surface level and uninteresting. Some of the lyrics on here are just really hollow flexing that just isn't super interesting too. A lot of really corny bars and lines and puns on this thing as well that just aren't super interesting, or maybe make you laugh in a way, not because they're really funny, but because they're so bad that they end up being kind of funny. Yeah, the lyrics on this project through and through are just really terrible, and the features on this project are pretty awful too, save for a YBN Corday feature on this thing, which is actually pretty okay, but that's really the only moment on this project as a whole that's actually kind of okay. Literally every other part of this project is really terrible and gross and just unpleasant to listen to. So, yeah, avoid this record if you haven't heard it already. Moving on, though, let's stick on the topic of hip-hop releases with really gross lyrics to them with the newest record from Kanye West, Jesus is King. This is a record that I didn't review on the channel just because I really just, at this point, did not want to give Kanye any more attention in a full-length review, even if it wasn't a review where I was going to be talking about him positively. But yes, I did hear this project, and here and now is where we're going to be talking about it, even if it is briefly. And honestly, a lot of my complaints with this project are the same complaints that a lot of other people, a lot of my other fellow critics on the site have had about this record. The lyrics on this thing are really gross. It's just the perfectly awful marriage between Kanye's ego and the absolute worst of Christianity coming together here on this thing to produce some really awful lyrics that, yeah, make me feel really gross. I just want nothing to do with them. The sound of this thing is pretty terrible too. The instrumentals sound like garbage here. And yes, I'm talking about the new updated version of the record, not just the really crappily done original release of it too. Even the newest, most updated version of this record still sounds really crappy. Just the way everything is mixed together sounds terrible. It sounds really slapdash, like Kanye just threw this together in a few hours one day, which is probably not how it should sound given the amount of times he seems to have delayed this thing, and the fact that the record as a whole isn't really even all that long either. The beats here just aren't super interesting too. The gospel influences on this thing just feel really surface level and uninteresting. I'm not the biggest gospel fan by any means. and I don't know the most about the genre, I can admit, but even what I hear on this thing just sounds like the most tacky, surface level kind of gospel influence I could expect to hear on a record. And Kanye has done better gospel influence on previous songs of previous albums of his before, so why he's so bad here, I don't know, but it just doesn't sound pleasant at all. As for Kanye's rapping on this thing, at best, it's not super interesting. At worst, it's just outright terrible. The same could really be said for his singing here as well. And the features here really just aren't super interesting too. The clips feature is probably the best part of this thing, but even then, it's not the most interesting thing. Certainly not worth listening to the album just to hear it or anything. It just makes for a really unpleasant listening experience, this album. The fact that it's so short and so shoddily put together just makes it feel like I said before, like Kanye just threw it together one day because fans keep asking for it, and he just threw it out there into the world, and that's how we ended up with this thing. Because honestly, this is such a crappily put together and slapdash product that I have a hard time believing that someone who had spent months laboring over it would actually release it. Like, as much as I don't really care all that much, at least in comparison to a lot of other people for Kanye, I can at least admit that he's a pretty meticulous artist when it comes to putting his stuff together, but that's just not the case at all on this new record here. Really, there's like nothing positive I could say about this record. Lyrically, it's really gross. I want nothing to do with it. The performances on this thing suck. The instrumentals suck. The way it's put together sucks. The runtime of this thing is really meager and uninteresting. It's just a bad album from start to finish. Avoid this record if you haven't done so already. It's not worth listening to, trust me. And moving on, we reached the #1 spot on the list. The worst record of 2019, in my opinion. This pick shouldn't be too much of a surprise to anyone who was paying attention earlier on in the list, as I kind of alluded to it somewhat. So yeah, without any further ado, the #1 pick on this list is Logic's Supermarket. This is a record that came out actually before Confessions of a Dangerous Mind. However, I didn't really have to talk about it much when speaking of that project because this record is one that is a very different breed of record. Whereas that album is pretty much a straightforward hip-hop release, much like Logic's other material, this is pretty much Logic's attempt at an indie pop rock record that also happens to double as a soundtrack for the book that he released earlier of the same name. And Logic's attempt at this style of music is just really terrible, honestly, from start to finish. Nothing about this album is good. The instrumentals are bland as could be. They're the kind of instrumentals that you might hear in the background of like a YouTube video. They're just that bland and uninteresting and just overproduced too at times as well. They just really have no firepower to them, no passion, nothing like that at all. And Logic's vocals on this thing similarly aren't super great too. For the most part, he's singing here on this project, and his singing voice really isn't all that great. Maybe I could see it working over some rougher sounding instrumentals, but over the instrumentals here on this record, it just makes it even more apparent that his singing voice isn't all too great. Maybe for the occasional hook on one of his records, it's not all too bad, but for a full record of it pretty much, it just doesn't go over well. The occasional rapping that you do get from him on this thing also isn't super great too. It's definitely better than the singing, but it's just not super memorable or interesting. And these song topics and concepts on this thing really aren't all too great either. I haven't read the book tied to this record, like I said in my review of this thing, but the story that's kind of laid out here across this record is one that I just don't really like all too much, mostly because the main character here is kind of creepy and gross in a way that I don't really like. Not in the same way that the lyrics from Confessions of a Dangerous Mind are kind of creepy and gross, more so in the way that he's kind of, going after this girl in the story and all of that kind of leads to some things I think are a little bit gross and make the protagonist seem kind of unlikable. Maybe in the book things play out slightly differently, or maybe there's a bit more detail added in the book that makes the protagonist a bit more likable, and if that's the case, then please leave in the comment section down below if that is the case so I can know. But just given this album here by its lonesome, that is not really the case, and a lot of the lyrics just end up rubbing me the wrong way. This record's influences are also so painfully apparent that oftentimes it feels like a lot of these songs are just ripping off ideas from different artists, like Radiohead, for example, at various points on this thing. I've heard Mac DeMarco being a name cited when it comes to influences for this project. I can't really confirm that myself because I'm not really super familiar with his music, but maybe that is in fact the case here. And there's one track on this thing that is pretty much just like a straight up Red Hot Chili Peppers ripoff. Like, every aspect about the song, from the instrumental to Logic's inflection on this thing, to the lyrical subject matter that he tries to go into, feels like something that you would expect to find on a Red Hot Chili Peppers track, but it's not. When it comes to which record is worse, this one or Confessions of a Dangerous Mind, since I've heard people debate and argue about this for quite a bit now, I could perfectly understand if you happen to dislike the other record more, but for me personally, on that project, at the very least, Logic was playing around with styles and ideas that, you know, he's kind of familiar with already, and as a result, some things like the instrumentals and some of the flows end up being, at the very least, like, acceptable, even if they aren't super interesting. Whereas this record is just such a far out there idea, and it's just played out so terribly that I wish that early into the development of this project that Logic, or maybe someone else working on this record, had come to the realization that this was just a bad idea from the get-go, and that this record just should not see the light of day, because it's very apparent listening to this thing that this record not only didn't need to exist, but it just, based on Logic's skills that are on display here, it really shouldn't exist, because he doesn't do this style of music any justice. This record doesn't do his career really any justice either. Like I said, this record doesn't need to exist. He would just go on to drop another record a couple months later, which still wasn't any good, as I talked about before, but yeah, this record just did not need to exist at all, and it's just not a pleasant listen at all either. It's just, yeah, a terrible record from start to finish. Avoid it if you haven't heard it already. It's not enjoyable, it's not fun, it's not even a so bad it's a good kind of listen, so just, yeah, steer clear of this one. But with that said, that concludes today's list, the top 10 worst records of 2019, in my opinion. Of course, it is just my own opinion, so if you happen to disagree with anything I said today, that's perfectly fine. In fact, feel free to leave your own thoughts on these albums I talked about today, or drop your own list in the comment section down below. I greatly appreciate seeing it down there. And while you're down there, make sure you also leave a like on the video, and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content, things like album reviews, track reviews, and of course, more year-end lists. Like I said before, this is the first one, and we have plenty more coming soon, so make sure you subscribe if you want to see that content. In fact, it might already have been released based on when you're watching this video, so make sure you check that stuff out if it has already been released too, so you can see my worst songs, best albums, best songs, all that jazz. So yeah, check that stuff out. Thank you for watching once again, and stay golden.